And thank you everybody for your time this evening. It's such a pleasure to be here. I'm joining you this evening from the unceded ancestral lands of the Comox First Nation on the east coast of Vancouver Island. And I am Animal Charity Evaluators' relatively new Director of Research. I joined ACE in July and went through a really busy evaluation season. So well, I come with the caveat that I'm relatively new, and so I might not have a lot of historical knowledge about the organization, but I am extremely open to hearing your ideas, suggestions for the future, and how ACE can do better, how we can do good better. So I'll share my screen. So I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of what ACE assumes is the problem. So animal suffering in our world is diverse, it's really immense. The magnitude of human-caused animal suffering inflicted on farmed animals in particular dwarfs all other categories of direct animal use. So things like, companion animals, animals in labs, etc. So as a comparator, for every one dog or cat euthanized in a shelter, about 3,500 farmed land animals are confined and killed. And when it comes to wild animals, their number far exceeds the combined number of humans, farmed animals, companion animals, and all other animals. And unfortunately, many wild animals, possibly the vast majority, are harmed either directly or indirectly by human activity. At Animal Charity Evaluators, we think animal suffering matters morally, and we aim to find the most effective charities that are helping either save or improve the most animal lives. Now, of course, this is not news to you that we are an effective altruist organization. We use the scale, tractability, and neglectedness framework to identify important cause areas. I'm sure you're all familiar, but I'll just say that, when we think about scale, we ask questions like, does the cause attempt to solve important large-scale problems? If efforts in this area were completed successfully, how much better would the world be? For tractability, how easy or hard is it to make progress on the issue? Can the problems that we're facing be partially or completely solved with current knowledge or technology? And then for neglectedness, does this cause get less attention or resources than other causes with similar scale and tractability, other important activities that need more funding? So when we think about scale, then these are approximate figures for current global populations of animals in different categories. As you can see, the farmed animals and wild animals outstrip the other numbers of animals. So when we think about cause priority areas for ACE in terms of the scale of the numbers of animals impacted and the numbers of animals currently suffering, then we prioritize farmed animals, especially chickens and fish, and we prioritize wild animals. And we currently these numbers don't capture invertebrates at all, but at ACE, we also would include insects as a priority. And simply because, animals are capable of feeling pain and suffering. So this is a huge amount of suffering that we can potentially relieve by working on the largest numbers of animals in these categories. So as you probably all know, a tractable cause is one where significant progress could be made relative to the total size of the issue using a realistic amount of resources. The most tractable causes are those for which we can clearly understand the problems and possible solutions, and for which we have experience implementing those solutions. Many causes that charities work on have only some of these characteristics. For example, we might know what a problem is, but not know whether our proposed solutions will solve it. We might know what the solutions should be, but find them hard to implement. And advocates working in different sectors may disagree about problems and solutions, even if each side feels they clearly understand the issues. So tractability is one of our factors that is a little sticky to apply, and we'll get into how we use the scale tractability neglectedness framework to make our recommendations. In terms of neglectedness, now this does just focus on the situation in the United States, but it's used just to illustrate the example of neglectedness that of domesticated land animals used and killed by humans in the US, over 99.6% are farmed land animals. About 0.2% are animals in labs, 0.07% used for clothing, 0.03% are killed in companion animal shelters. But when we look at charitable donations to animal charities, 66% of charitable donations go to companion animal shelters. 32% go to groups with mixed or other activities, and just 0.8% of donations go specifically to farmed animal organizations. So on the basis of neglectedness, we would, for example, at ACE, prioritize advocacy efforts to save farmed animals over companion animals in the US. So let me tell you about our charity recommendation process. This is kind of just an overview. We have several sequential stages with new recommendations being released around the end of November each year. We tend to publish our recommendations currently about a week before Giving Tuesday. The goal is to identify the most effective animal charities, not to rate or grade all animal advocacy organizations. Quite a large number of organizations are considered in the early stages of our process. We have a spreadsheet of over 1,000 charities that are on our list. And then we go through a charity selection process based on things like, our cause areas and our priority areas. And we narrow that down until we recommend a few groups that are considered to be the most effective that go into our review process. They go under our review process. So ACE evaluates animal advocacy organizations to find those that are able to do the most good with additional donations. Following anti-speciesist principles, we recognize that success can take many different forms. We aim to compare different types of successes by the amount of animal suffering that they can prevent or reduce. There is a bit of a lack, well, a lot of a lack of empirical data about the effectiveness of different interventions in the animal advocacy space. So there's a fair amount of guesstimation that happens through our process, but we've tried to come up with ways of approaching our charity evaluations based on our 4 criterion that are as objective as possible. So I'll go through each of our criteria in turn. So for programs, a charity that performs well on this criterion has programs that we expect are highly effective in reducing the suffering of animals. What I will say is that to even be reviewed by ACE, we already expect that programs would be highly effective because we've gone through our charity selection process that also relies on our kind of prioritization areas. So effective programs either work in high priority cause areas or countries, or target high priority animal groups, work towards high priority outcomes, or pursue interventions that are expected to be highly effective. So this year, we introduced a scoring framework to assess the effectiveness of charities, programs, building on those 4 categories, so animal groups, countries, outcomes, and interventions. And we used the scale, tractability, and neglectedness framework to score different types of animal groups, countries, outcomes, and interventions based on their priority level. And I will say that in addition to scale, tractability, and neglectedness, when we were prioritizing countries, we also included an assessment of global influence. Using the scores that were generated and information supplied by each charity about their use of program funding, we arrived at a singular program score for each charity that represents the expected impact of their collective programs. So how much impact we anticipate that they would have based on the interventions that they're using. For cost effectiveness, a charity's recent cost effectiveness provides an insight into how well it has made use of its available resources. And it can be a really useful component in understanding how cost-effective future donations to a charity might be. So to assess the cost effectiveness of charities' programs, we considered their approaches to implementing their interventions. And to do that, we used the intervention scores from the program criterion. We look at their recent achievements and the costs associated with those achievements. And as with the programs criterion, this year we adopted a scoring framework to assess cost effectiveness. So we began our analysis by comparing a charity's reported expenditures over the past 18 months to their reported achievements in each of their main programs during that time. We then weighted each program proportional to its cost to arrive at an overall cost effectiveness score for each charity. So what we ended up with was a program score for a cost effectiveness score for each of the charity's programs, and then an overall cost effectiveness score for the whole charity. We also, as part of that process, we verified select achievements that were reported by the charities. So if they're giving us their key achievements, we have a verification process using both publicly available information, internal documents, media reports, independent sources, and of course, following up with the charities themselves. So you can see how the programs and cost effectiveness criteria kind of dovetail together. We also look at room for more funding. So a charity that performs well on this criterion has plans that cannot be fully accomplished with the expected funding from other sources, and the barriers to accomplishing these plans are strictly monetary. So they wouldn't be due to lack of time, lack of qualified personnel, or other non-monetary issues. If a charity has room for more funding, the funding that is expected to come from an ACE recommendation would be very likely to increase the charity's total impact. So this room for more funding criterion aims to investigate whether charities can absorb and effectively use funding that new or renewed recommendation, a new or renewed recommendation might bring in. We ask charities to estimate their projected revenue and their plans for expansion for the next 2 years, assuming that their ACE recommendation status and the amount of ACE-influenced funding they receive will stay the same. And this year, we also began assessing our level of confidence in charities' projections, the feasibility of their expansion plans, if they were to receive funds beyond their predicted income. So we use those assessments to estimate room for more funding, adding additional funding to replenish reserves wherever possible. And then lastly, we do assess leadership and culture. So a charity that performs well on this criterion has strong leadership, healthy organizational culture, and that includes a healthy attitude towards representation, diversity, equity, and inclusion. The charity acts responsibly towards stakeholders, including staff, volunteers, donors, and others in the community. And in particular, staff and volunteers feel engaged with their work and protected from harassment and discrimination. In this criteria this year, we examined information provided by charity leadership. We gave out a culture survey to staff at each organization, and we looked at the results of that survey. We looked at transparency regarding leadership and governance, and we also factored in any unsolicited testimonials or whistleblower reports that were sent our way. We don't actively go out and gather those. Those are if anyone writes to us independently. Because we are not a watchdog organization, and we frankly lack the expertise and capacity to conduct our own investigations into whistleblower reports, our only aim this year, at least, was to determine whether there might be issues in a charity's leadership and or culture that might have a negative impact on staff productivity and well-being. We did use an internal scoring framework to facilitate detailed discussions about leadership and culture of charities. that were under review and to compare the 12 charities under consideration with each other. And in the end, we simply noted whether we had any concerns or not regarding the charity's leadership and culture. We prioritize protecting the confidentiality of people who respond to our surveys and whistleblower reports, so that that scoring is kept internal. So together, we use those 4 criteria and our scoring processes to make our recommendations decisions. And I know in the past it's not been super clear how ACE actually arrives at our recommendations decisions. So here's the spreadsheet of scoring, and we made this public this year. So to decide on our recommended charities, we gathered all those assessments and scores for the 12 participating charities. You can see those in the left-hand column. And we assigned them, we kind of went through this scoring process, yet another scoring process. Ultimately, what we would have liked, I think, is to have a reliable score for each criterion that then can maybe be additive, and then a charity gets an overall score and then they get ranked. Because we don't give scores necessarily for room for more funding and for leadership and culture, we weren't able to just be additive and just add those up. So what we did instead was we used an iterative ranking process rather than simple voting. So in the past, I know there's been kind of discomfort among ACE staff on what happens if there's a split vote. So if there's a charity under consideration and 3 of our team vote yes and 3 of our team vote no, what do we do with that? So instead, we use an iterative ranking process that honors the fact that disagreements between committee members are somewhat, our evaluation members are somewhat inevitable and expected. And so rather than disagreement being a roadblock, it's now kind of baked into the process a little bit. So committee members don't necessarily need to agree or reach consensus to generate a ranked list of charities. And I'll explain why that is and how this table was generated. So what happened was that our evaluation committee members scored each charity on a scale from 1 to 7. So 1 is that we strongly reject this charity for recommendation. 7 is I want to strongly recommend this charity. And we use the criteria, scores, and assessments as our guide. So I can tell you the way that I did it, and we still need to work on making this process uniform across our team members. But the way that I did it was I looked at the program scores that we gave the 12 charities, and then I ranked them, and I looked at the cost effectiveness scores and I ranked them, and I looked at where charities placed. Then I looked at whether they had room for more funding for $200,000 or more than $1 million. And then I let leadership and culture kind of, if there were major concerns that we had with a charity, I let it move the dial a little bit on whether this would be a 3 or a 4 or a 2 or a 3. So that's how I approached it. I know that's how several other of my team approached it as well. So what happened was we scored anonymously and independently of each other for those 1 to 7 scores. We then met, and our scores became open, and we were then able to make our case about why we had scored the way that we had. Then our evaluation committee members went away and we rescored things. So we were able to adjust our scores in light of hearing perspectives from others about why they scored the way that they did. And then we had adjusted individual scores, which is what you're seeing here. So after stage 3, you can see that for the first charity, for example, 4 of us were like, we really want to strongly recommend this charity. And then 1 person was a 5, which is still a recommend, but it's like softer. It's a soft recommend. So that's how this scoring went. And like I said, this is in a web page that we have on our website now. And then we discussed our final rankings to just make sure that we were all in agreement, even though there's disagreement among our scores. Were we actually all okay with the way that this ranking went? And then we decided on a cutoff point. And this year you can see that anything 5 or higher meant that each individual was recommending that charity. And you can see that here for charity 6, there was disagreement that straddled that recommend or not recommend. And so we used that as our cutoff point this year. We also then had to assign top standout, standout designations. This year, we made one charity our top charity, and the other 4 were standout charities. And you're welcome to ask me questions about that too. So at the end of this process, here are our charity recommendations for 2022. So the Good Food Institute was our top charity this year, and it joined Faunalytics, the Humane League, and Wild Animal Initiative, who were recommended last year. And all of our charities retain their charity status for 2 years. So that's why we've got 4 and not just 1. And then our standout charities for 2022 were Fish Welfare Initiative, the Danish Vegetarian Association, the Turkish Farm Animal Protection Association, and Syneria Animal. And they join our standout charities from last year: Compassion USA, Dharma Voices for Animals, the Federation of Indian Animal Protection Organizations, Material Innovation Initiative, Mercy for Animals, New Harvest, and Xiaobu Vegan. I'll leave it there because I'm sure people have lots of questions. I've been talking for a fair bit. This is where you can read all of our blog posts and things. I will say that we've got a renewed commitment to transparency. And so there are blog posts that either are published already or are very soon to be published that give a lot more detail about how we approached each of our evaluation criteria this year. And then if you have questions, you can email me. So I'll wrap up there, I'll stop sharing, and I guess I'm handing things over to Dan at this point, right?
All right, everyone can see me? Yes, thumbs up? Okay, great. So thanks everyone for coming. We're gonna switch gears and talk a little bit about climate now. So a little bit, what is Giving Green? Well, we're a charity and climate strategy advisor for climate change mitigation, a little bit like ACE. Our main product is a set of top recommended nonprofits to fight climate change, specifically mitigation, trying to stop climate change from happening. But we're going to see that we also take a couple different angles as well. There's going to be some differences. Just a little bit about us. We started a little bit in the end of 2019 and have very slowly been growing. We have a goal of always moving at least money 10x our operating costs, and we've hit that over the past couple of years, doing about 12x and moving around $2.5 million. We're spending more money now in 2022, so I hope we're going to have a lot more impact. So what are we going to do? Talk a little bit about why we do climate, our research process, major conclusions of the 22 research, our recommendations in 22, and then a little bit on differences and similarities with Founders Pledge, who are the other kind of big name charity evaluator in climate in EA. Okay, so I think the first thing is there's been a lot of debate within the EA community of, do we care about climate change? And so I'm gonna make a very brief case for yes, and actually at least try and convince people that it's actually much more mainstream within EA Voices than you might think. So the first data point is that there is this big report written by John Halstead, which was kind of written as background for What We Owe the Future with Will MacAskill. And he comes to this conclusion that's been a little controversial, where he says, look, climate change is probably not a super serious X risk, but still says it's one of the most important problems of the world. Maybe not quite as bad as AI safety and biorisk, but really up there in terms of things that we should be worrying about as humanity. And so if you care more about this, you can read his gigantic 400-page report. It goes all into this. Second thing is that a lot of people within EA think climate is a big issue. So again, it's maybe not like the top of everyone's minds, but it's somewhere near the top. This is the EA survey in, there's no way it can't be 2022. I think it's 2020. And then the last one is that, like, look, if you look outside of EA, climate change is just a huge topic of concern, and there are billions of dollars being allocated towards climate. So we actually at Giving Green see non-EAs as our main audience and are trying to influence like many different types of donors out there in the world, and trying to move a lot of this money towards less impactful causes towards more impactful causes. So that's a little bit about Giving Green, why we exist, why you should care. Now, onto our research process. So there's a couple things. One thing that's a little bit different than we do from some EA organizations is we are trying to find some of the highest impact climate organizations, which we know EAs care about. But we also sometimes do research on more specific issue areas where we know there's a lot of interest, either from a specific person who's asked us, or we just know that there's out there to provide targeted recommendations for people who have inelastic preferences. So some example of that is historically we've done a lot of research on the carbon offset market, even though we really don't think that carbon offsets are the most impactful things we can do. That's a $100 million market growing to $1 billion projected over the next couple of years. So there's a lot of money to be influenced there. And similarly, we have a suite of recommendations for Australia because we received a lot of demand from some Australian donors. So we look at our audience in two major buckets. The first are individual and smaller foundations. And for that, we have our list of top nonprofits. And then we also have a suite of recommendations targeted at businesses who are trying to create pro-climate strategies. And we have a kind of push to try and convince businesses to think beyond the bounds of a standard net zero strategy. And that's the topic of a white paper that we just released a first draft of. And we also make some recommendations in the carbon removal and carbon offset space. Okay, so what does our research strategy look like for our top nonprofits? And apologize for this slide with a lot of text, but don't worry, I'll walk you through it. So what we did is we started with, so we have a final goal, which is, to decrease the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere or decrease the amount of warming for the lowest amount of cost, highest cost effectiveness. And what we did is we started with a comprehensive list of strategies that different organizations are working on to achieve this. So for instance, international coordination, US federal policy, nuclear advocacy, et cetera. Really long list. And then we went at the strategy level to try and find which strategy seemed the most promising. And we're using a very similar importance, tractability, and neglected framework like you heard from ACE, but we start with it on the strategy space. In our view, just the world of climate is so incredibly wide. We need to start by focusing on certain strategies and then move to the level of organizations. So once we have this long list of strategies, we cut it down, did some brief investigations, cut it down to a short list. And then within this short list, we did shallow dive investigations on different strategies. So for instance, you can see some investigations on our webpage of coordination to cut down methane emissions, or forestry, or food policy, et cetera. From those, ones that are more promising, we turn into these deeper dives. And at the end of that road, we have this short list of strategies where we're actually going to go look for organizations. So then within the strategies that we're excited about, we create long lists of organizations, cut them down to short lists, and then do what we call shallow dives on the short list of organizations. The top ones, then we do what's called deep dives, and then we get our final list of recommendations. So all of this is eventually going to get up to our website. Again, in the interest of transparency, some of these pieces are a little bit behind, but eventually you should be able to find our first prioritization step, shallow dive investigations at the sector level, deep dives on the sector level, shallow dives on the organization level, deep dives on the organization level, and the final list of recommendations. How do we do the evaluations? Well, we use a number of tools. So like I said, we use this ITN framework, which you use some kind of combination of qualitative and quantitative assessment there. One of the things that we do at both the sector level and the organization level is build detailed theories of change and then try to list all the assumptions of the theories of change and then conduct research to try and see how how strong we think those assumptions are and how valid we think they are. So, to give an example, for some pro-nuclear advocacy orgs, some of them have a theory of change that works through the regulation side, and some have a theory of change that works through a legislation side, and some have a theory of change that works through a public opinion side. And so we'll write out these theories of change, write out the assumptions, and then when we do the way we gather data is we talk to lots of people, maybe we talk to maybe 40 people in nuclear space, from academics to philanthropists to industry vets, et cetera, and try to ask about these key assumptions of the theories of change that the different organizations are working on. Can nonprofits change regulation? What is industry doing, and is there actually space for nonprofits to get involved? And these all become inputs into our final decision. We also do quantitative cost effectiveness modeling, which is not a huge part of our final goal, because most of the organizations we're working with are doing advocacy or technology promotion. That's very hard to model, but when we have the opportunity, we do attempt to model. Okay, so a little bit of an example of what one of these theory of changes might look like. So one of our recommendations this year, Industrious Labs, they're doing government advocacy and corporate advocacy are the inputs. And then, in order to actually result in greenhouse gas emissions, we need government procurement policy to change. We need legislation to pass. We need corporate procurement policy to change. And so what we did is we kind of took this theory of change, turned it into a list of assumptions, and then went and researched all of these assumptions to basically see how plausible all these links on the theory of change are, along with looking at previous success of the organization, reputation, track record, et cetera. Okay, wow, this slide is blurry. So anyway, these are some examples of assumptions. Let's just skip that. A little view of how we do some of this cost effectiveness analysis. So we build models both in Excel and in Guesstimate. I don't know if any of you guys are familiar with this. This kind of this cost effectiveness software developed by some EAs where we build a model in Excel, and then you can plug into the model and pick different distributions of parameters and do a Monte Carlo simulation to kind of get an idea of a sensitivity of your model to various parameters. So this kind of thing is helpful. I think it is important to know that a lot of these parameters are very difficult to know, especially there's key parameters for advocacy organizations. We have to put in what is the chance, what is the chance that because of the existence of Industrious Labs, the US government adopts a policy that all vehicles they buy have to have zero carbon steel. And you have to come up with some number for that is something key that these models hinge on, and we do our best, but that's just one input into many things we do to try and come up with our final recommendations. Okay, so let's get to some of the results. So we said that first of all, we had these top climate strategies. So in 2021, we'd focused on US policy, mainly because we thought it was just an incredibly fruitful year for US policy with the Democratic trifecta and a lot of climate bills under discussion. So our previous recommendations were all about US policy. In 2022, with these major climate bills passing, we reevaluated our 2022 recommendations to try and understand which ones we thought were still valid and exciting, given these new bills that have passed. A lot of the nonprofit space and US climate policy is moving towards implementation and regulation around the legislation that has been passed. So we spent some of our research work on that. The three new sectors that rose to the top of our prioritization list are decarbonizing heavy industry. So this, we're talking about strategies for steel, aluminum, fertilizer, et cetera, that are basically not covered in most countries' climate policy and are just a major portion of global emissions where there isn't really a clear policy roadmap. In some sectors, there is a technology roadmap, and in some there's not. The next is advocacy for advanced nuclear power. It seems pretty likely that nuclear power is the most realistic way to get a clean energy mix in many parts of the world. And this is an area that has been historically neglected by traditional environmentalist philanthropists who many tend to be anti-nuclear. So we think it's a place that's very promising that doesn't have the right amount of philanthropic attention. And the last one, which will have some overlap with what ACE is doing, we did a bunch of, wrote a report on agricultural emissions and decided that one of the most promising philanthropic levers that people can pull are trying to decrease meat consumption, which has climate effects both through, well, meat production has climate effects through both land use and methane emissions. And so we're excited about thinking about ways to decrease meat consumption. So those are the topics. Now, what do top nonprofits tend to look like? I think the biggest thing is this first bullet, which is that we believe very strongly that the best bang for your buck is to be found in organizations that are working on big systemic issues, trying to change the energy system, which generally means organizations that are working on policy and technology. We think that these organizations tend to be an order of magnitude more effective than direct emissions reduction projects like tree planting. We think, I didn't really go into it as much as in the previous presentation, but we do analyses of room for more funding and really trying to think about what orgs are going to, additional money can really cause them to level up their operations. So we tend to look at organizations that are on the smaller side and not on the radar of the big donors, but have a really exciting growth plan and seem to have a lot of room to do more if they have more money. A lot of these orgs are working on neglected technology and have a lot of technical expertise. And we look, because a lot of the work we're doing works through the policy lever, we look for orgs that have experience turning research and campaigns into actual policy. I didn't talk a lot about the business white paper to this audience, but I just wanted to give a little bit of a preview, or a little bit of a highlight of that research. So essentially, we wrote this white paper on what businesses should do to fight climate change, and there's a couple of takeaways from that. The first is that most businesses are making these net zero commitments, and if you actually take those seriously, they're essentially not possible because there's no supply of the carbon removal that businesses need to achieve net zero. And we also don't think it's the most cost-effective thing businesses can do anyway. So we try to have a set of recommendations to try and steer businesses to more cost-effective, like wide-thinking strategies, and we recommend that for longer businesses with large supply chains and a lot of market power, they can make catalytic investments in the specific industries where they work. A couple examples, there's the Fortescue mining company in Australia that's making like pretty impressive investments in trying to decarbonize the mining industry. This will have spillover. They're using this in their own operations, but it will have spillovers to the rest of the industry. Google is doing something very cool, trying to procure 24/7 renewable electricity, which is basically seeding a market that didn't exist before. We think the best opportunity for smaller businesses is contributing to catalytic funds for carbon removal, which is a way that the business sector may be able. The business sector and the world at large is going to need carbon removal to go net zero in the future. And then again, if businesses are tied into some of these net zero commitments, we have some recommendations on high quality offsets and offsetting strategies, including carbon removal, that we think are better than the status quo. Okay, so to the recommendations. So we have 5 recommendations that are our top recommendations. The first is Clean Air Task Force, which has been a darling of the EA community for years. So this probably won't surprise anyone who's been looking at looking at climate, they've gotten so much bigger since they first came on the radar of EAs. It's hard to make some of the same arguments that they're like small organization, unknown, et cetera. They've gone from about a 5 million budget to a 30 million budget. That being said, they still have a really unique strategy working on neglected technologies. They've expanded their geographical reach to work both on the subnational level within the US and in Europe and Africa. And I think starting in Asia as well. They've expanded to other other sectors like hydrogen that they weren't doing before. So basically think that they have a winning strategy and they still have room to productively absorb more funding. Next is Evergreen Collaborative. This was again one of our recommendations from last year. The Evergreen Collaborative was started by veterans of Jay Inslee's presidential campaign. They were essentially his climate team, and his policy became Biden's climate policy. That a lot of that became the Inflation Reduction Act. So these are real policy wonks who understand the climate legislation that got passed and are very well poised to ensure it gets implemented correctly through both advocating for regulation and trying to work at the state level to ensure that complementary policies are passed, and that the IRA actually gets the impact it's supposed to. So they're super small. They just started a couple of years ago. They've gone from nothing to about 2 million last year, and maybe they'll be up to 6 million this year. Next, we have 3 new organizations for this year. The first is the Good Energy Collective. They are a relatively young advocate for advanced nuclear power. They mostly focus in the US, but also working on starting to expand to international work. They're doing a lot of work to try and spread the path for deployment once some of these new companies pass regulatory barriers. They're trying to build up a whole bunch of communities who are excited and ready to deploy these new nuclear plants, which will hopefully really increase the speed of deployment, and also working on a lot of former coal communities to try and do this trendy coal to nuclear conversion thing that a lot of people in the climate space are excited about. Next is Good Food Institute, an overlap with ACE. Yay. We're really convinced that agricultural emission, well, the data shows very clearly that agricultural emissions are a big part of the climate problem. There's not a clear technology roadmap for how to decrease agricultural emissions. Almost half comes from livestock, and there's no really clear way. The result of our research, the most clear path forward, we think, to decreasing agricultural emissions is by drastically decreasing meat production. And we think the most realistic way to do that is through alternative proteins, and that GFI is just a major influence in the space of pushing that technology and marketplace forward. And finally, I talked quickly before about Industrious Labs. So, we're excited about both agriculture and heavy industry as sort of the next frontiers of the climate problem. Industrious Labs is brand new. They launched in October, but they're a bunch of veterans of an extremely successful campaign in the US run by the Sierra Club called the Beyond Coal campaign that worked on closing down coal power plants. So Industrious has they're basically spinning up campaigns that are industry specific and are working to advocate both on the supply side of people producing, say, aluminum or steel, to understand the technology needed to go green, and then working on the demand side with, say, car companies and government to try and get them to pass procurement regulations and procurement commitments to ensure a marketplace for zero carbon heavy industry products. On the business side, the business recommendations are a little bit more complicated because I mentioned, we think especially big businesses can be making internal catalytic investments, but for businesses that want to make external catalytic investments, we think a really good option are some of these funds that are working to catalyze investments and demand in carbon removal. And there's two that we're highlighting and recommending. One is Frontier, that's been started by Stripe with the support of Meta, McKinsey, Alphabet, and Spotify. They're about like a $1 billion advanced market commitment for carbon removal. There's also a smaller one called Milky Wire that's based in Europe, but we also think are making very intelligent early purchases of carbon removal, and have like a slightly different strategy than. Okay, I'm only going to talk for a couple more minutes, but I wanted to talk quickly about some similarities and differences between Giving Green and Founders Pledge, because there's kind of two games in town in terms of EA climate evaluators. So I think the first thing to note is that Giving Green and Founders Pledge really agree on a lot of things. When Founders Pledge looks at our charities and we look at the disbursements of the Founders Pledge Fund, we tend to agree on a lot. And I think we agree on really high, big picture things, such as this focus on systemic change, specifically through policy and technology. And we both have a bias towards smaller organizations. So a lot to agree with. And I think that it's helpful to think of these orgs as very complementary. We both have small research teams. We're working on slightly different areas. We're finding different high impact organizations, which I think is great. Founders Pledge runs a fund model. So basically the way you support Founders Pledge organizations, you give to the Founders Pledge Fund. That's great. It makes things easy. Maybe one downside of that is it's not always clear whether orgs in their fund have room for more funding if you want to give individually. Giving Green has traditionally done individual recommendations instead. We recommend orgs and people give directly to them. However, this year we are starting a fund, which is basically supposed to make giving to all of our organizations easier through one click. The fund is hosted by Giving What We Can. Founders Pledge is really focused on just looking for globally the most cost-effective organizations. As I mentioned before, Giving Green is looking for super high cost-effective organizations, but also some best of class in categories of interests like carbon offsets, carbon removal, and Australian policy, where we've seen specific demand. One slightly different approach that we take is Founders Pledge has this quite explicit focus on climate damage as their outcome metric, and they use that to direct a lot of their research. We agree with that, but we kind of think that for most things, CO2 emissions are a close enough proxy for climate damage, and so we focus on CO2 emissions. And also, we think that's super helpful because our audience we're really pushing for a general audience, and it's just a lot easier to communicate, especially outside of EA. So we think that this is just the right space for us. Which gets us to our next thing, that Founders Pledge's primary audience, at least historically, has been Founders Pledge measured and the EA community. We were really big on pushing out communication and advocacy to the general public in the climate philanthropy space. And then one thing that we disagree about a little bit is that Founders Pledge is somewhat less optimistic about doing policy advocacy in wealthy countries. And Giving Green is somewhat more optimistic about finding cost-effective opportunities in organizations working in wealthy countries. A little bit about us, just in case you guys run into people. Justin LeBay is our director of research. He works in New York. He lives in New York. He sometimes comes to EA New York things. He gave a speech to some other EA New York thing. Maybe some of you know him. If you ever see him around, say hi. We also have two researchers, Lucia Simonelli and Kimberly Hune. Emily Tai is our Do Everything Operations Manager, and Sunny Huang in London is our Communications and Development Officer. That's it, right on time.